Okay, welcome back. Today we're going to continue our study of k-nearest neighbors, and we'll look at it in a little more depth with some examples and simulations. And we should have a pretty short meeting today, so we'll see how that goes. Okay, so as you may recall from our meeting on Tuesday, our premise here is going to be a binary classification problem. We have a set of labeled inputs with all labels having 0 or 1. And we want to train a classifier for this data. So for example, imagine all of these orange points are the 1 labeled samples, the blue points are the 0 labeled samples, and we're interested in classifying this green point. To classify the green point, we need to find its nearest neighbor, which means we need some way of measuring the distance to the neighbors. In this case, I decided to use the L2 norm for the distance metric. So I'm actually just computing this by hand. So for every value in the training set, I'm computing the L2 norm of the difference between the test point and that training example. Then I'm sorting that array of distances. So I have an array of distances for all test points. Then I'm going to sort them. So sort them in order of distance, but also get their indices. And I'm getting the k smallest. So in this case, k equals 1. And my prediction is going to be the y value of whichever point happened to be the nearest neighbor. So that's what I see here. Of all of these points, the one that happened to be closest was this one right here with the black circle around it. You could see this is my test point. And so I've classified my test point as an orange point because the closest neighbor is an orange point. Now that works by memorizing the training data, which means that I would assume that unless I have points that have equivalent X data but different Y data, my training error should be 0, which is exactly right. So if I run the same exact algorithm for every point in the training sample, the mean the mean accuracy is just 1. So I get perfect score. Now we said this approach is a bit sensitive to noise. So instead we might look for the k nearest neighbors where we search for some predefined number of neighbors. So now we'll repeat it. It's the same algorithm as before, but now k equals 3. So I'm still going to be computing an array of distances for every training point. And then I'll sort them and get the k smallest. And that will give me an array of 3 nearest neighbors. And then I'll take the mode of those 3 nearest neighbors. So what is the most frequent prediction? So here's a plot of this one. I have my same point. So this is my test point. Now I have 3 nearest neighbors. And my prediction for my test point will still be orange because that's the mode of the nearest neighbors. But now I also have some measure of my confidence in my prediction. So I can estimate the confidence in my prediction as the proportion of the k neighbors that shared the label that I predicted. In this example, all 3 of the nearest neighbors have the 1 label. So I'm pretty confident in my prediction. But I might have some other examples where I'm less confident because some of my neighbors have 1 label, some have a different label. Here's an example with a larger test set. So here are the kind of light shaded points are the training points. And the dark shaded points are the test points. And the size of each point indicates the confidence in the prediction. So you can see that in this region where essentially all of the training points are orange, we have pretty high confidence in our prediction. And when we have a test point in that region, it's generally the case that all 3 of the nearest neighbors are orange. So we have high confidence. But in this middle region, it's not the same. So here, for example, you can imagine this point has as its nearest neighbors probably this, this, and this. So 2 orange points and 1 blue point. So you might predict it as orange because that's the mode, but you have slightly lower confidence in the prediction. So that's why it's shown as a smaller point. Now, we also noticed that unlike the previous case where the training error for one nearest neighbor was 0, here in a training sample, you might have one training point that has a different label than its 2 nearest neighbors. For example, you could imagine, let's see, this point right here might have as its 3 nearest neighbors this point, and this point. So it would be classified as blue, even though it's a training sample. So the training error is not necessarily 0 for k nearest neighbors. And that's what we see here. So our training accuracy on this test, on this training set is 98%. Then asked, what do we do if k is an even number? So that's usually why we pick k to be an odd number. You can see in this illustration from the lecture notes, there are some of these little cells where it's shaded in white. That basically means that it was a tie. So there was one positive and one negative sample in that region as the nearest neighbors. And so the algorithm basically shrugs and says it's a toss-up. So that's why we usually pick k to be odd. Okay, so far I used this hand-coded KNN classifier. So I was computing this array of distances. By the way, if you look at this line here, let's actually break it down. Okay, so it starts off as a for loop. So I'm doing for x train in x. I'm computing this. So for each training sample in x, I'm computing this. Then I get an array. Right? So if I want the result to be stored in an array, I can actually just use list comprehensions, which we had in that reference notebook in week 1. So I can compute this as a list comprehension. And now the same results will be stored in an array. And since I want to be able to use these numpy functions on it, I'll make it a numpy array. So I'll pass the same list to the numpy array function. Now I have these distances. Next, I'm going to sort those distances. So argsort is a really neat function. It returns the indices that would sort the array. So let's print both the array and the argsort version of the array. So here are the distances. Here's the argsort. You can see each entry is an array index. So this tells me, for example, the smallest distance in the distances array is the one with index 49. And that's actually this one. So you can see it's true. The second smallest in the distances array is the one with index 5. So that's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is the second smallest, and so on. So this tells us, let's say, this gives us an ordered list of the indices of the distances array. And then I just want, let's say, the k smallest of the k points with the smallest distances. So I can get, let's say, k of them, 3 of them. I could get 1 of them. I could get 5 of them. This just gives me the first however many entries of the list. In a moment, I'm going to show you how to do the same exact thing using the sklearn implementation. But you'll see in this week's homework that there are some limitations of the sklearn implementation. So you'll end up having to write your own KNN classifier, which is basically exactly this. But in the homework, you'll actually have to use a custom distance metric that you write. So that's why I'm walking you through that in a little bit more detail. You'll have to do it again this weekend. Okay, any questions on these few lines of code? So this is the KNN algorithm in a nutshell. I compute the distances between my test sample and every training sample. Then I get an array of sorted indices for those distances. I get the k smallest. And then for the y values for those k points, I take the mode. Okay, so let's look at the sklearn implementation. I mentioned last week that these all are kind of standardized. They have the same methods associated with them. So all of the supervised learning algorithms in sklearn have a fit method and then a predict method. So it's very easy to use. You use them all the same way. We'll define a classifier. We're going to pass any arguments we want, like hyperparameters. So in this case, we'll pass the number of neighbors, which is k equals 3. And then we'll pass fit, we'll call fit, and we'll pass the x and y data. And then we can use a predict function to get the prediction of the algorithm. Now, one thing you might notice, you might expect that when you use a k-nearest neighbors classifier and fit it, you might expect it to be very fast. And that's because we said that fitting is just a matter of storing the data. But by default, the k-nearest neighbors classifier, I'm going to press spacebar here so I see the details. By default, you could see it tries to organize the data in a sort of data structure that then makes it easier to find distances later. So that's why it gives you this choice of algorithm. So for example, brute force, KD tree, bool tree. Bool tree and KD tree are ways of organizing the data to make it easier, more efficient to find the nearest neighbors later. So that's why it can take a few moments to actually fit the data. Even though we're just storing the data, we're storing it in this special data structure. Okay, so I'm going to fit the data and then make my predictions. And just as with the logistic regression classifier, we have not only a predict function, but we can also predict the probability of any particular prediction. In other words, we can get our confidence in each prediction and not only the label. So here we're using that to get our contours. Okay. And here you can see in this dark shaded region, we have high confidence in our prediction. In the lighter shaded region in the middle, we have slightly lower confidence in our prediction. Okay, let's try a few things. What do you think will happen as we vary k? So let's increase k to a bigger number. Let's increase k to 15. Now we can see that our test point is classifying according to the 15 nearest neighbors. And you can see there are now many different confidence levels in the middle. In this case, our training error did not change. And here you can see basically the farther we get from the separating line, the separating hyperplane, because this is a linearly separable data set, the more confident we are in our answer. And as we're closer to that separating hyperplane, we're somewhat less confident in our answer because a smaller portion of the nearest neighbors will share the same class label. Okay, for a moment. All right, we mentioned a few issues with k nearest neighbors. One of them is the importance of standardizing features. So we said that k nearest neighbors, unlike the logistic regression, for example, doesn't learn anything about which features are most important. When you look at the logistic regression homework, for example, you saw that it determines which pixels in a handwritten digit are most relevant for determining each class. Some of the pixels are really unimportant, right? And those will have essentially a 0 weight. K nearest neighbors doesn't learn anything at all about which features are most important. And every feature is weighted equally. This has two implications. The first implication is the importance of standardizing. So let's see how that works. I'm going to generate some data here where both variables are on a similar scale. So here's a data set where both variables are on a scale from 0 to 1. Both features are on a scale from 0 to 1. And they're both distributed uniformly in that range. And here's a test point with its 5 nearest neighbors. Now, what do you think will happen if I now measure x1 in different units? Okay. So let's say previously I might have measured, let's say, x2 in millimeters and x1 in hundreds of dollars. And now instead, I'm still measuring x2 in millimeters, but I'm measuring x1 in dollars. That means every x1 value is going to be 100 times bigger. So I'm going to take exactly the same values, multiply them by 100. Now, how does this change the nearest neighbors of my test point? This was before. This is after, when the x1 range is very different. So when the x1 range is very different, because it has a larger range, it starts to dominate the distance calculation. And now when I select my nearest neighbors, I'm essentially ignoring the x2 axis, because along the x2 axis, all of my neighbors are fairly similar, right? They're all within 1 of me. Whereas on the x1 axis, some of my neighbors are extremely dissimilar just because of the larger magnitude. So if you have uneven feature ranges or units, then it's really important to standardize your data by either scaling to common min and max, or else standardizing by removing the mean and dividing by the standard deviation before you do your k-nearest neighbors. Okay. Now that was one implication of equal weighted features. The other implication is that if you have uninformative features, they can dominate the distance calculation. So as an example of that, we're going to look at some image classification data. And this is a data set that has small, low resolution images in these 10 classes. So small color images of planes, cars, birds, cats, deer, dog, frogs, horses, ships, and trucks. Now, here's an example from that data set of a car. So imagine this test sample, and imagine you're looking for the nearest neighbors in the data set. Well, one of the closest neighbors to this car is this image of a deer. Why is this image of a deer considered a very close neighbor of this car? Is it because the deer has car-like qualities to it? Okay, so they both have red backgrounds, very prominent red backgrounds. Now, when we're comparing the pixel-wise distance between this image and this image, every pixel counts equally, which means the background pixels over here count just as much as the foreground pixels over here. So in this case, the image of the deer is considered a very close neighbor. The image of the car, which has a different background color, but is actually a fairly similar white car, is considered a much farther neighbor. Right? Here, the L2 distance, is it L2? I'm not sure if it's L2 or L1, but whatever it is. No, it's L2 distance. Okay. The L2 distance of a deer is about 12. The L2 distance of the car is about 30. Now, one other issue, even besides for the fact that all pixels are considered equally important, or all features in general are considered equally important, is that in any event, pixel-wise distance does not really reflect visual similarity. So I'm going to show you another example of images from this data set. So here's the same test sample, the same deer. And now the third image is a frog. And notice that the frog is considered almost as similar to the car as a deer. Can we kind of look at the frog and see why it's considered very similar to the car? Okay, so in terms of visual perception, the car and the frog do not look similar at all. The car and the deer image look very similar. The car and the frog do not. And that's just because this pixel-wise L2 distance is not at all a good measure of visual similarity. So we can see that it's kind of tricky to use k-nearest neighbors for any image process, like computer vision applications, unless you have some very good distance metrics. And in general, pixel-wise distance metrics don't work. Now, there are some very good distance metrics that work well for images. For example, for the MNIST data set, so that handwritten digit classification data set, let's take a look at this part of the textbook for a moment. So I'm going to show you an example from Elements of Statistical Learning, which is one of the textbooks you might refer to for this course. I believe we're going to be looking for something like 400 something. Okay. Okay, so here's an example. So we have these handwritten digits, and there's an interesting distance metric you can apply to these. That's partly like translation or rotation invariant. What does that mean? It means that the distance metric according to between, let's say, a test image and a training sample will be similar no matter how those images are rotated. So here you can see the same image with different rotations. And there is a distance metric known as tangent distance, in which it's invariant to this transformation of the training and test distance. So this kind of shows a little bit how that works. It's kind of complicated to wrap your head around without much more math, which we're not going to do. But you can see that, you know, the Euclidean distance between this training and test sample for a handwritten digit is just the distance for one particular rotation. The tangent distance tells us the smallest distance under rotation of both the training and test samples. So what that means is that if there is a rotated version of the training sample that's very similar to a rotated version of the test sample, they'll have a small tangent distance. So that's obviously a much more sophisticated distance metric than just the pixel-wise Euclidean distance. And it turns out to give really good performance on this MNIST data set. This is actually the performance not for the MNIST data set, but for a slightly more difficult handwritten digit data set. And you could see the error rate of the nearest neighbor with the tangent distance metrics is extremely small. So it's approximately a quarter of what, let's say 0.025 error rate, which is extremely small. So in general, it's not very useful to use k-nearest neighbors for computer vision applications with a very basic pixel-wise distance metric. But sometimes there are more sophisticated distance metrics that can actually do a very good job. Okay. One of the major benefits of the k-nearest neighbors is that it can learn very complicated decision boundaries. And that's something we'll come back to again in the rest of the course. So previously, we were looking at examples of classifiers where the decision boundaries were linear. Right? So last week, for example, we looked at the logistic regression, which learns a linear decision boundary. And we said in part of our Colab lecture, we said that just like with the linear regression, you could use a basis function transformation in order to learn a nonlinear decision boundary. But that's not often a great solution because you need to somehow know in advance what basis function transformation to use. So the nearest neighbors is different in that you don't need to know in advance anything about the functional form. Instead, you just learn the functional form from the data. So we'll take an example with a polynomial decision boundary. Okay, so here is, let's say, this polynomial line. We'll call it the true decision boundary. And then we have some noisy training data. And we'll use our sklearn k-neighbors classifier to learn the training data. And let's plot the model prediction over the input space. So here I'm showing you, let's say, for every point in a 2D grid on the space, what would be the model prediction and what would be the confidence in the prediction. So you can see it pretty closely follows that polynomial line. Near the decision boundary, we have slightly less confidence in our prediction, but for the most part, it gets things right. And we can see that again as a contour plot. Okay, any questions so far? We're going to finish so early today. Okay, so far we only looked at our k-neighbors classifier, but we said it can also be used for regression. And the only difference in the algorithm is that previously I used the mode of my nearest neighbors. When I do the k-neighbors regression, I'll probably use a different metric, for example, the mean or the median. So let's look at that. I'm going to create some kind of complicated data where y is equal to sine square root of x squared, x1 squared plus x2 squared. So it's kind of a complicated distance metric, a complicated function. And here's what that looks like for my training data. Okay. So here, each of these points is a training sample. And the color of the point shows the value of y, which is the target variable I'm trying to predict. I'm going to add a test sample now. And then we'll try to use k-nearest neighbors to predict its value. So it's the same algorithm as before. I have k equals 3. I'll get my array of distances. I'm going to sort my array of distances, get the k closest, or get the index of the k smallest distances. And then I'll take the mean of those, of their y values. So here's my example. This was my test point. The value of the true function at that point, so this is the true function that I kind of made up, is minus 0.8377. And the predicted value at that point is the mean of these 3 nearest neighbors, which is minus 0.805. So it's pretty similar. Now, this was kind of easy because it's a smooth function. Imagine I had a function that was very not smooth. So let's say I had a function where y was something that varied very abruptly in like this checkerboard pattern. Would my k-neighbors regression learn this well? Well, it would do a pretty good job inside the regions, but near the edges, it would probably be somewhat more difficult. Okay, let's also see how to use the sklearn implementation. So it's very similar. It's called a k-neighbors regressor instead of a k-neighbors classifier, but it has the same methods. So all of my sklearn supervised learning models have a fit and a predict. I'll use fit. And then I can use predict to basically plot the entire output space. So this is the true function. Okay, so I'm looking at my training data kind of on top of this. But this is the true function I'm trying to predict, and this is my k-neighbors classifier. How did it do? Okay, so it did a reasonably good job of learning this complicated functional form. Do you think it would do better or worse as I, let's say, change k? Let's try and make k small. I'm going to make k equals 1. Okay. So with k equals 1, I have kind of much more, let's say, abrupt changes in the predicted value as I move from, let's say, one prediction region to another. Let's try the opposite extreme, k equals a big number. I don't even remember how many training samples I have. Let's see. Okay. So this is with k equals 51. And I had about 100 training samples to begin with. As k gets bigger, I start to predict what's essentially the mean value, right? So here, for every point in this space, I'm using half of the training points and taking their average to predict the value. Let's try something a little bit more intermediate. Okay. So you could see the larger the value of k, the smoother my regression prediction gets, but it's also kind of pushed towards the mean of the entire training set. So that's a trade-off that we're going to see here. Let's look at that a little more formally. So we'll look at the bias and variance. And as always, we'll start with a poll. So I'm going to show you two classifiers. We'll use classifiers. One will be a k nearest neighbor with k equals 1. And one will be a k nearest neighbor with k equals 15. And this is going to be a classifier for my polynomial decision boundary data. Okay, take about 15 more seconds to vote. Okay, so most students think that model B with the more neighbors will have more bias, and model A with fewer nearest neighbors will have more variance. So let's see. Run my simulation. Okay, so here's my data. It's the data with a polynomial decision boundary. And in the output of the simulation, I'm not going to plot all the data. I'm going to plot the decision boundaries of individual realizations of this model. So just as before, we're going to kind of train this model many times on independently generated training sets. And I'm going to plot the mean of all their decision boundaries and the mean decision boundary. Okay, let's look at this image. I'm going to relaunch the poll. Okay, looking at this image, which model has higher bias and which model has higher variance? Okay, here in this image, the black line is a true function, and the thick purple line is the mean decision boundary of many models, and the lighter purple lines are the decision boundaries of individual models. Okay, take a few more seconds. All right, so here model B has more bias. You could see that by looking at the difference between the black line and this dark purple line. So you can see in many parts of this result, there's a systematic difference between the mean of many models and the black line. Whereas for model A, you have a little bit of that, but really not too much. So model B has substantially more bias than model A. What about variance? So for variance, we're looking at how much these individual purple lines vary around the darker purple line. So basically, how much all of this varies around the dark purple line. And we can definitely see that, there are some parts of model B, especially near the edges, with a little more variance. But for the most part, in model A, there's a lot more variation around the dark purple line of the individual purple lines. So model A has a higher variance, and model A was the one with the single nearest neighbors. Model B has more bias. Now, in this next cell, I'm not computing the bias and variance of the output of Y, but just the bias and variance of the boundary, just because it makes it easier to see what we're looking at here. Okay, and here you can see the squared bias along the boundary is higher for model B, whereas the variance on the boundary is higher for model A. Okay, let's try some other versions of this simulation. Okay, I'm going to increase K to, okay, I'll use K equals 3 for the first one, and K equals 51 for the second one. Okay, let's see what happens. Okay, so which has more bias, which has more variance? Okay, take about 15 more seconds to vote. Okay, let's look at the results. Okay, so here's model A with K equals 3. Here's model B. It's very obvious that model B has substantially more bias. So as we increase the number of nearest neighbors, we're less and less able to learn a kind of a complex decision boundary, because having to use many neighbors kind of smooths everything out. So the more neighbors we look at in computing the mode, the less complex the decision boundary we can learn. Let's see the variance. So here it's a little bit difficult to see from the image, but we do have a higher variance along the boundary for model A. All right, let's look at a different example. Okay, so I'm going to go back to, let's say, let's go back to k equals 15 for both. But now I'm going to fit one of them on all of the training data, say 200 samples. And the other one, I'm just going to fit on 50 samples. Okay, so this is a little tricky because our analysis of bias and variance didn't really contribute the number of training samples. The training samples are all uniformly distributed in the featured space. Okay, let's do a little poll, right? So I have two nearest neighbors classifiers. Model B is trained on fewer samples. Take a few more moments. Okay, so let's see if our intuition is right. So here's model A and model B. Here it seems like model B has both more bias and more variance. Okay. So notice that both of them were trained with 15 nearest neighbors, but model B was trained with fewer samples. Okay. So what happened here? And here's the bias and variance along the boundary. So both are higher for model B. So intuitively, we can kind of understand that the variance measures how dependent the result is on the particular draw of training samples, right? Let's remind ourselves. So this expression is a variance, and it's the difference between an individual trained model on one particular training set and the mean trained model over many random draws of training samples. So it tells us how much the individual model varies according to the random draw of the training sample. So with that in mind, it kind of makes sense that if the training sample is smaller, right, then each individual point has kind of more of a contribution, which means that there's more variance due to different training samples. So the greater the contribution of any one point, the more variance. So this is our intuition in general, not only for k nearest neighbors. In general, the variance will be higher if a model is trained on a smaller training set. Now, what about the bias? A bunch of students thought that model B would have higher bias, and that was the case here. Why did your intuition tell you that the model trained on fewer training samples would have more bias? Okay, because it would learn a line which did not account for a large set of the available samples. Well, I mean, in general, anytime we train a model, right, we're always training on some subset of the, let's say, population. So we're always training on some subset of training data, which does not reflect the entire population. And we assume that the training data is distributed similarly to the population. So here, the training data on which model A and model B are trained are similar. Let's try and maybe plot versions of this data. Okay, so imagine you have a 200 sample version of the data and a 50 sample version of the data. If you have a smaller number of samples, on average, your k nearest neighbors are going to be farther apart, farther away from any given test point. Is that right? So let's imagine we put some random test point on either of these plots. So this test point is going to be much farther from its 15 nearest neighbors than this test point. So intuitively, that's why the smaller the number of training points, we have more bias because our mean estimate might be pulled farther away from the individual test point. So this is not necessarily a general result for any possible function, but for many functions that we might think about, if we have a smaller number of training samples, the mean estimate from, let's say, k of those training samples is going to be farther away from the test point than if we had more training samples. So that's why our intuition tells us that in many cases, the smaller the training sample size, the greater the bias. Now, if that's the case, would we rather have a large training set most of the time? What's the disadvantage of a large training set here? Okay, well, there might not be as much available for validation, potentially, but Michael has it right. So the time complexity for inference for k nearest neighbors was ONT. So for each test point, we have to compute the distance to every single training point. That's very, very slow. So k nearest neighbors is often not practical if you have a very large training set, unless you're able to do some kind of fast k nearest neighbors where you don't necessarily have to compute the distance to every test point. Now, in practice, k nearest neighbors is used for larger training sets, but only with, let's say, some of the methods that we're not going to get into for storing the training sample in a way that makes it easier to find either the nearest neighbors or approximate nearest neighbors. Okay, let's see where we are. All right, so since k controls the bias variance trade-off, we can use k-fold cross-validation to choose the optimal k. Now here, I'm showing you an example of a data set that's a circle inside a circle. Okay. So the 1 class is in the inner circle, and the 0 class is in the outer circle. And I'm interested in determining what is the optimal value of K for classifying this data set. So I have a fixed training set with 100 samples. 75 samples, 25 samples from a validation set. 25 samples from a test set. And in a previous lesson, we learned how to use sklearn's k-fold cross-validation. I'm going to show you here a really neat function called validation curve. Validation curve lets you look at the k-fold training and validation scores for any machine learning model, so any classifier or any regression model, as you vary some hyperparameter. So here's how it works. It's going to return two arrays, an array of training scores and an array of validation scores. Then I pass in some arguments. The first argument is what type of machine learning model I want to use. Okay, in this case, I'm going to pass an instance of a k-neighbors classifier. Then I'll pass the data. Okay, so here, this is a data that I've allocated for training and validation. So it's not my test data. My test data is a separate set. Looking back here, so I'm passing this entire training set. It's going to split it up for me into training and validation. Okay, so I pass the training set. Then I tell it which hyperparameter I want it to tune. So in this case, my k-neighbors classifier has an n-neighbors argument, and I wanted to tune the n-neighbors argument. And I wanted to try all values from 1 to max k in increments of 2. So it's going to try 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. And then I'm going to say, okay, use a 10-fold cross-validation. So this is all it takes. I don't have to worry about loops and indices. It's just one line of code, and it's going to run the cross-validation for me and return the array of training scores and array of validation scores. Let's see what those looks like. Okay. So here, let's say this is an array of 10 training scores for n-neighbors equals 1. Okay, so this is for the 10 folds for n-neighbors equals 1. So the first candidate model was n-neighbors equals 1. And I have the training scores from 10 folds. Then I have the training scores from 10 folds for n-neighbors equals 3, and so on. And I have something similar for validation scores. So again, it's giving me an array of the validation scores for 10 folds for n-neighbors equals 1, then for n-neighbors equals 2, and so on. Okay, so here I evaluated 5 candidate models with 10 folds. So I have an array of 5 arrays where each array has 10 entries in it. Then I can compute the mean across each candidate model. Okay, so let's just see what that gives us. So let's say this is a validation mean across one model. Okay, so now for each of my 5 n-neighbors, so let's say for n-neighbors equals 1, n-neighbors equals 3, n-neighbors equals 5, and so on. I have my mean validation score, and then I'll do the same thing for my training score. And I can also compute the standard error in a similar way. And then I can plot it just as before. So this shows me what happens to my accuracy score as I increase k. Let's run it again from beginning to end just to kind of see how it works. All right, so slightly different results for slightly different sets. That's normal. Now, we said in a previous lesson that we select the best model that's, let's say, simplest model that still has good performance. For k-nearest neighbors, a lot of students get confused about this. The simplest model is not the one with smallest k. You might think like, oh, it's simpler to find the nearest neighbor than, let's say, the 5 nearest neighbors. The simplest model, in a flexibility sense, is a model that is less flexible at learning complicated functions, which means a larger number of nearest neighbors. So here we're looking for the simplest model, meaning the model with the largest k, where the validation score is within one standard error of the best validation score. Okay. So here we chose, let's say, 7. So the model with the best validation score with k equals 3. But we chose 7 because it's a simpler model that's within one standard error of this score. Okay, any questions on that? All right, so we have one more little topic and then we're going to finish early for like the first time ever. So we mentioned in our lesson that one problem with k neighbors is the curse of dimensionality. So we said there's this problem that if you have a fixed number of training samples, as you increase a dimension, the pairwise distance between them grows exponentially. And that means that when you're looking for k nearest neighbors and higher dimensions, you have to look over a greater and greater proportion of the feature space as your dimension increases. So we're going to look at an example of that. Here I'm going to have, let's say, 30 training samples, and I'm looking for 3 nearest neighbors. Okay. Now imagine at the beginning, my nearest neighbors are, okay, so my training samples are just along a single axis. So I have one feature. So here's my test sample. Okay, it's that green sample here. And it's a little difficult to see because it's like almost on top of a training sample, but that's okay. And I have my 3 nearest neighbors circled in black circles. And this green line here shows how far I have to search to find my 3 nearest neighbors. So with my training samples uniformly distributed along this feature space from x1 equals 0 to x1 equals 1, I have to look over this much of the feature space in order to find my 3 nearest neighbors. Now, with one dimension, my feature space, my nearest neighbors are relatively close in the feature space. I didn't have to look over too much to find my nearest neighbors. Now we'll try and repeat this, but this time I'm going to look over 2 dimensions. So here's my sample. Now, the data is actually the same as before. So before, we were only looking along the x1 axis. And when we were only looking along the x1 axis, let's say this is my test point, and I could find 3 training samples that were pretty close. This one, and this one are pretty close along that x1 axis. And that's actually what we found here. So those 3 training samples. Now, however, I need to look for a distance according to 2 features. So I'm looking in a bigger feature space. Okay. And now I need to go farther in order to find my 3 nearest neighbors. So you could see that, let's say, with only one dimension, I have to search a smaller fraction of the total feature space to find my 3 nearest neighbors. With 2 dimensions, I have to look at a bigger fraction of the overall feature space, which is a unit squared, to find my 3 nearest neighbors. And in a 3rd dimension, so now I need to look over this entire 3D sphere to find my nearest neighbors. And it's an even more substantial part of the feature space, which is a 3D cube. Now, looking at this image here, so you could see that green point is in the kind of in the center of this sphere. And it has to search this entire sphere to find the 3 nearest neighbors. And what you could see is that the three nearest neighbors, which are kind of maybe even at the edge of the sphere, you could see the three nearest neighbors are kind of larger points here. They're not even really that much closer to the test point than any of the other points. So it gets to a point where as the dimensionality increases, you have to search so far for your three nearest neighbors that they're not even that much farther than the rest of the test point, which means your assumption at the beginning that the, let's say, prediction for a new test point should be similar as a value of similar training points, that assumption kind of breaks, because in higher dimensions, the training points that you find as similar points are not even really that similar. So this is what we call the curse of dimensionality. Okay, so I believe that's all for today. Since we kind of didn't really get very far as we had wanted to in the lecture section this week, we also don't have that much to review in this section. Are there any questions? Okay, so the question is, do we usually use the recall and precision metric to measure a k-nearest neighbor model? So the metrics we discussed in the notes on classifier metrics are kind of model agnostic. So whatever model we use for classification, we'll end up with some confusion matrix that shows the correct and incorrect predictions for each class. And then depending on the cost of different type of errors, we would use various other metrics like recall and precision to evaluate our model. And all of that is model agnostic. So it doesn't really care whether you used a logistic regression or k-nearest neighbors classifier or anything else. The confusion matrix that you end up with at the end only depends on the error of your model. It doesn't really depend on the functional form of your model. Any other questions? With radius-based neighbor learning, what estimate will the model produce if it discovers no neighbors in the radius? Okay, good question. Let's find out. Since we have a bit of extra time, we can do that. Okay, let's go back to my k-neighbors classifier. And this time, instead of using a k-neighbors classifier, I'm going to use a radius neighbors classifier. Okay, so I'll generate some data here. So we have a radius neighbors classifier. Let's define the radius as a very small number so that we'll see what happens if it doesn't find any neighbors. Okay. So you can see it gave us a value error for some of the test samples I tried. So here I tried to generate a prediction for this entire feature space. And for some of the test samples, it said no neighbors were found. You can try using a larger radius or give it a label for outliers. So let's see what that option looks like. Okay, so I can set a larger radius, or I should be able to specify an outlier label. Okay, so an outlier label is a manual label for samples with no neighbors. So let's try most frequent. Okay, so for anyone with no neighbors, I'm going to say, give it just whatever the most frequent label is. And now everyone ends up with the most frequent label. But really, it would just be better to use a larger radius. And that comes out much better. Okay, if we take an infinite number of tests, wouldn't the mean model with 50 training data be the same as a mean model with 100 training data? Okay, so this is about the bias variance thing, right? So it's a little different. So when we looked at the, let's say, the linear regression or the logistic regression, and we looked at the bias with different number of training samples. Right? So in that case, let's say the error that we would expect to see in the model was only due to, let's say, some noise. Right? So the error was due to the noise. So in that case, it, okay, and either way, let's think about a different way to explain this. Okay, so imagine I have this data. And suppose I have this complex decision boundary. And then I imagine I have some test points. So imagine, some training points. So imagine I, let's say, train the model using, let's see, I'm going to do a different decision boundary. I'm trying to think for a minute. Okay, it's a little complicated to think about. I want to be a little more precise. What's definitely true is that it will depend on the function. Right? So this bias term we had, it's not very easy to think about in a very precise way because it does depend on the true function. But let's see. But you can, yeah, it's complicated to think about. In this evaluation, in this derivation, we said that the training samples were fixed. So that's why, it didn't, nothing we did here kind of considered the effect of n. But I'm going to try to think some more about your question about the bias and the number of training samples, and I'll see if I could get back to you on that. I'll post something on Ed about it. All right, any other questions? All right, very good. I'll see you all next week. Take care, everyone.